I never wanted a roommate. When I got my acceptance letter to Blackwood University, the idea of sharing a tiny dorm room with a stranger made my skin crawl, so I paid extra for a single. Privacy, silence, freedom. I should have known it was too good to be true. The dorm they assigned me, Everett Hall, was old. The kind of old where the pipes groaned at night and the wooden floors creaked when no one was walking. But my room, room 733, was worse. It felt wrong the second I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick, as if no one had lived there for years. The furniture was standard, bed, desk, wardrobe, but the walls, they were covered in scratches, deep, jagged marks carved into the drywall. I ran my fingers over them. Names, dates. Some I could barely read. Others were fresh, too fresh. Then I saw the door. A second door beside my closet, narrow, metal, with a heavy-duty padlock bolted across it. It wasn't on the floor plan. The first night I barely slept. The dorm was too quiet, too still. At 3:12 a.m. I woke up, heart pounding, unsure why. Then I heard it. A whisper, muffled, coming from the locked door. I shot up, holding my breath. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was dreaming. But then, scrape, 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 a sound like fingernails dragging against the metal. I didn't sleep after that. The next day, I asked around. Room 733? My RA, Claire, paled. They actually put someone in there? My stomach tightened. What do you mean? She hesitated, then sighed. There was a girl last semester, Erin. She lived in that room. Claire glanced around, lowering her voice. She went missing. My mouth went dry. They never found her. She just disappeared. Her door was locked from the inside, but she was gone. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, just gone. I felt cold all over. Claire shifted uncomfortably. They were supposed to close that room. I guess they didn't. I wanted to transfer, I wanted out, but there were no open rooms, so I stayed. And that night, the whispering returned. By the fourth night, I was losing my mind. The whispers, the scratching, the feeling that something was watching me from behind that locked door. I couldn't take it. At 3 a.m., I snapped. I grabbed my desk lamp and slammed it against the padlock. Once, twice, 3 times. The metal groaned, and with one final hit, it snapped. The lock fell to the floor. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. I hesitated, then reached out. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Rot, damp, something old. The room was tiny, barely a closet, and in the center there was a hole, a gaping black hole in the floor. The edges were lined with scratch marks. Like someone had tried to climb out. I stepped closer, heart hammering. And then I heard breathing, deep, wet, right in front of me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was in that hole, and it wasn't human. A shadow shifted beneath the floor. And then it moved. I slammed the door shut, threw the broken lock on the ground, and ran. I didn't stop running until I was in the lobby, gasping for breath. I refused to go back. The housing office finally moved me to another dorm. I didn't ask questions. I didn't explain. But a week later, I saw maintenance outside Everett Hall. They were sealing room 733 shut, not just locking it, sealing it. I don't know what was in that hole, and I don't want to find out.
I always thought horror stories about college dorms were bullshit. Ghosts, curses, weird disappearances, just the kind of thing upperclassmen made up to scare freshmen. Then I moved into Holloway Hall, and now I know better. Holloway was one of the oldest buildings on campus, built in the early 1900s. It was all brick and iron, with long, dimly lit hallways and a permanent smell of mildew. I was assigned to room 306, third floor. My roommate, Jake, was already there when I arrived. Blonde, athletic, the kind of guy who'd join a frat by the end of the week. We clicked right away, both of us excited for the freedom college offered. The first thing he told me, though, was weird. "People say this floor is haunted," he said, smirking as he shoved a duffel bag under his bed. "Apparently some guy lost his mind and jumped from a window in the 80s. Now he walks the halls at night." I laughed. "Right, and let me guess, you only hear him at 3 a.m. Jake shrugged. "Something like that." I didn't think much of it, at least not until that first night. I woke up to footsteps, soft shuffling steps right outside our door. I squinted at my phone, 3:14 a.m. At first I thought it was just another student stumbling back from a party, but the steps didn't stop. They paced up and down the hallway, slow and deliberate. Then came the knocking, 3 knocks, light precise, then silence. I held my breath. My bed was closest to the door, and I swore I could hear breathing on the other side. A full minute passed before whoever it was moved on. The steps faded into the distance. Jake snored in the other bed, completely oblivious. I didn't sleep after that. A few nights later, we got invited to a party in room 319. It was the first big one of the semester, and Holloway's third floor was notorious for throwing wild ragers. By midnight, the room was packed. Music blasted from a shitty speaker. The floor was sticky with spilled beer, and everyone was drunk off their asses. I was leaning against the wall talking to this girl, I think her name was Emily, when the lights flickered. The crowd groaned. Someone yelled, "Fix the damn wiring!" Then the power cut out completely, pitch black. People laughed nervously, phone flashlights flicking on. Then somewhere near the door, knock, knock, knock. A hush fell over the room. I turned my phone's light toward the sound. The door was wide open. The hallway beyond it was dark. "Who the hell?" Jake muttered, pushing through the crowd. He stepped into the hallway, looking both ways. "Nobody's here." A guy near the window shivered. "Dude, this is just like the stories." "What stories?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "The guy who jumped. They say he knocks on doors before he—" A scream cut through the room. We spun around. Emily was staring at the closet door, her face pale. There's someone in there." The room fell dead silent. Jake, either the bravest or dumbest guy in the room, stepped forward and yanked the door open. Nothing, just coats, shoes, a half-empty bottle of vodka. Jake laughed, shaking his head. "You're wasted, Em." But then, a voice, a whisper barely audible over the pounding music from the other rooms. "Don't let me fall." The lights flickered back on, and the closet was empty. The party broke up soon after that. No one wanted to talk about what happened, but the mood had shifted. People left in groups, avoiding the halls. Jake and I walked back to our room, both of us quieter than usual. As we passed room 309, the door creaked open an inch. It had been empty since move-in day. No one had been assigned to it. I stopped. Something about the darkness beyond that door made my skin crawl. The air was wrong, thick, heavy, like stepping into a place you weren't supposed to be. Then a shadow moved inside. I grabbed Jake's arm. "Let's go." He didn't argue. I woke up again to footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps. The air in the room was freezing. My breath curled in the air as I turned toward the door. The knob was turning. My stomach clenched. The door creaked open an inch. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then I saw it, a shape, tall, gaunt, standing just outside our door. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like its neck had snapped. "Don't let me fall." My blood turned to ice. Jake gasped awake at the same time I did, and just like that, the door slammed shut. We didn't sleep. We didn't speak. The next morning we reported everything to the RA. He looked at us like we were crazy, but when we told him about room 309, his face went pale. "That room isn't supposed to be open," he muttered. "They sealed it years ago." We lasted another week in Holloway before we put in a request to move. The paperwork took a few days, but on our final night, something changed. The knocking didn't come from the hallway. It came from inside our closet. That was it. We packed our shit and left. I don't know what happened in room 309. I don't know if the stories are true or if the guy who jumped really is still walking those halls. But I do know one thing. The third floor of Holloway Hall never sleeps.
I had been dreaming of college for years. Freedom, new friends, a fresh start. But I never thought my dorm room would be the place where my nightmares took root. I was assigned to West Hollow Hall, one of the older buildings on campus. The walls were a sickly shade of off-white, cracked in places, and the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to be annoying. But I didn't care. This was my first time away from home, and I was ready for anything. My roommate, Lexi, was nice enough, A little too into true crime podcasts, but we got along. The first few weeks were normal. Late night studying, trips to the dining hall, awkward dorm floor meetings. But then the noises started. At first, they were small, a quiet tapping from the closet at night, as if someone was idly drumming their fingers against the wood. I figured it was pipes, or maybe just the building settling. But then, the knocking got more insistent. One night, I woke up to a scratching noise. My eyes flickered open, heart pounding. The sound was coming from inside the closet. "Lexi?" I whispered. She didn't stir. I turned on my phone flashlight and aimed it at the closet door. The knob was still. I told myself I was imagining things. I didn't even check. I just pulled the blankets over my head and squeezed my eyes shut until morning. Our dorm had been designed for 3 people, but we never got a third roommate. The extra bed sat in the corner, untouched. At first we used it as storage, but one day we found it perfectly made, the sheets tucked in tightly. Neither of us had done it. "That's weird," Lexi muttered, running a hand over the sheets. "Maybe a custodian came in? But why would they make a bed that no one was using?" A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of creaking. My breath caught in my throat. The noise was coming from the extra bed. I turned my head, barely breathing. In the dim light, I could see the blankets shifting, as if someone was lying underneath. A shape, vague but unmistakable, rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. I slammed my eyes shut. This wasn't real. It wasn't real. By morning, the bed was empty again. The sheets were still perfectly made. The next time something happened, Lexi saw it too. One evening, after a late-night shower, she came back to the room, pale and shaking. "The mirror," she whispered. There was something written on it. I rushed to the bathroom with her, but the steam had already faded. "What did it say?" She swallowed. "It said, 'Why did you leave me?'" Neither of us showered alone at night after that. We started researching West Hollow Hall, trying to make sense of the things happening in our room. It didn't take long to find the story. 10 years ago, there was a girl named Hannah who lived in our room. She had 2 roommates, best friends who did everything together. Hannah, on the other hand, was a loner. One night, her roommates left her behind to go to a party, locking the door behind them. She never made it out. No one knows exactly how she died. The story was that she had some kind of seizure, unable to call for help. Her roommates came back the next morning and found her cold and stiff in the extra bed, the same bed that kept making itself. After that, no one lasted more than a semester in our room. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavier. It was colder, like someone had left a window open, but they hadn't. And then, just as I started drifting off, I heard it. A whisper. "Why did you leave me?" I bolted upright. The voice had come from the extra bed. My stomach turned as I slowly turned my head. The sheets moved. Not a lot, just the smallest shift, like someone shifting under them. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then Lexi screamed. I turned to see what she was looking at, and my blood turned to ice. The closet door was open, and standing inside was a shape, tall, dark, wrong. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its stare. I don't remember screaming, but suddenly we were running, out of the room, down the hall, pounding on the RA's door until she answered. We told her everything, shaking and out of breath. By morning, we were reassigned to different rooms. We never set foot in West Hollow Hall again. I don't know who or what was in our room. Maybe it was Hannah. Maybe it was something else. All I know is, the next semester, another pair of girls moved in. And the extra bed was still waiting.
I never believed in ghosts. Not really. But after what happened in my dorm freshman year, I can't explain it any other way. I had just moved into Clifton Hall, the oldest dorm on campus. It was a massive brick building with ivy creeping up the sides, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. My room was 406, at the very end of the hall on the 4th floor. The floor was co-ed, but mostly guys, except for the sorority girls in 407. Yeah, somehow, 3 girls from Delta Kappa Beta had ended up in the room next to mine. They were gorgeous, loud, and way out of my league. I only knew their names because I overheard them talking constantly. Lacey, Brianna, and Taylor. They were always giggling, blasting music, and clomping around in heels at all hours of the night. The first night, I heard them talking through the thin walls. Normal stuff, boys, parties, whatever. But around 2 a.m., their voices got weird, muffled, almost like they were whispering, but not exactly. It was more like a low murmur, like when you hear someone talking through a vent but can't make out the words. I pressed my ear to the wall. That's when I heard the scratching. It was faint but constant, like nails dragging against wood. I figured it was just them messing around. Maybe one of them had a cat. But the next morning, when I saw them in the hall, I made a joke about the scratching. They just stared at me. "What scratching?" Lacey asked, her green eyes narrowing. I laughed. "Last night, like right at 2 a.m., you guys didn't hear that?" Taylor and Brianna exchanged a look before Brianna said, "We weren't here last night." I frowned. "What?" Taylor flipped her long blonde hair over one shoulder. "We stayed at the sorority house for the weekend. We didn't get back until this morning." I felt my stomach drop. I must have misheard. Maybe the sound had come from another room. Yeah, that had to be it. But that night, it happened again. The whispers started around 2 a.m. The same murky, indecipherable voices like a chorus of people whispering at once, and then the scratching. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Slowly, I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The voices, they weren't coming from 407. They were coming through it. I knocked on the wall. The whispers stopped immediately. The scratching didn't. I backed away from the wall, trying to tell myself it was just bad plumbing or rats or something logical. But then the scratching changed. It was on my side now. I turned on my light and stumbled backward, staring at the wall. Something was inside it. The next morning, I ran into Taylor in the communal bathroom. I didn't mean to bring it up, but it slipped out. "You ever hear weird stuff in your room at night?" She stopped applying her mascara and glanced at me through the mirror. "Like what?" "Like whispering, scratching." Her face went pale. "You heard it?" I nodded slowly. She looked around as if making sure no one else was listening, then lowered her voice. "You know about her, right?" I frowned. "Who?" Brianna and Lacey walked in at that moment, and Taylor immediately shut up. But I caught the way Brianna's face tensed when she saw me. Something was off. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the wall between my room and 407, waiting. 2 a.m. came. The whispers started. But this time, I could understand them. "Help me." My blood turned to ice. I shot up in bed, staring at the wall. The scratching started again, but it wasn't just scratching anymore. It was knocking. Soft at first, then harder. "Help me." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then a knock at my door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hesitated, then forced myself to move. I crept toward the door and opened it just a crack. Lacey stood there in her pajamas, looking terrified. "You heard it, didn't you?" she whispered. I nodded. She grabbed my wrist and pulled me into their room. 407 looked wrong. The air was thick, heavy. It smelled like damp wood and old books. The walls were covered in faint scratches, like someone had been digging their nails into the paint. Brianna and Taylor were sitting on the floor, huddled together. "We need to tell him," Taylor whispered. Lacey hesitated, then sighed. "Okay, but you can't tell anyone." She pointed at the closet. "That's where she died." I stared at the closet door, my skin crawling. "She?" I echoed. Lacey nodded. "Her name was Emily Carter. She lived in this room in 1973. One night, her roommate came back and found the closet door nailed shut from the outside. They had to pry it open." She swallowed. "Emily was inside, dead." My throat went dry. Brianna hugged herself. They said she scratched at the door until her fingers bled, but no one heard her. No one helped. I felt sick. Taylor whispered, "The weird part? No one knows who nailed the door shut." I took a shaky step back. Then we all heard it, a single, slow knock, from inside the closet. I don't remember much after that, just running. All four of us bolted out of 407, sprinting down the hall. We spent the rest of the night in the common room, too afraid to go back. By the end of the week, the girls had transferred dorms. I wasn't so lucky, but I never stayed in my room at night again. I found excuses to crash in friends' rooms, stayed late at the library, anything to avoid being alone in 406. By winter break, I'd managed to get reassigned to a different dorm. I never stepped foot in Clifton Hall again. But sometimes, even now, when I'm lying awake in my apartment, I swear I still hear the whispers and the scratching.
I never should have gone to that party. It was the first warm night of spring, and Delta Beta was throwing their annual night pool party. My roommate, Lisa, had been hyping it up for weeks. "It's legendary, Emma," she'd said, shaking my shoulders. "People talk about it for years. You can't just sit in the dorm while the rest of us have the time of our lives." I had hesitated. I wasn't much of a partier. Something about big crowds, loud music, and drunk guys always made my skin crawl. But Lisa was relentless, and eventually I gave in. I figured I'd go, stay for an hour, and then slip back to the dorm unnoticed. The Delta Beta house was a massive, old-fashioned mansion that had been converted into a frat house decades ago. Their backyard had a pool, an unusually deep one for a frat house, at least 10 feet at the deepest end. The moment we stepped into the backyard, I felt out of place. People were already soaked, some floating lazily on inflatable rafts, others dancing by the edge of the pool with drinks in their hands. Neon lights flickered, casting eerie colors across the water, and the air smelled of chlorine, beer, and sweat. Lisa disappeared almost immediately, swallowed up by the crowd, leaving me clutching a plastic cup of something too sweet and too strong. I walked to the pool's edge, watching the reflections ripple across the dark water. That's when I saw him. A guy stood waist-deep at the far end of the pool, barely moving. He had slick black hair and skin so pale it almost seemed to glow under the blue lights. But what unsettled me most were his eyes, too dark, too empty. He wasn't looking around, wasn't talking to anyone. He was staring straight at me. A chill prickled down my spine. I looked away, pretending to be interested in my drink. When I glanced back, he was gone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of drunken laughter and splashing water. I tried to have fun, but the moment kept replaying in my mind. That guy, his lifeless eyes, the way he vanished the second I looked away. By the time Lisa found me again, I was ready to leave. "You're so boring," she groaned, but she was too drunk to argue when I turned to go. Fine, just text me when you get back." I nodded and left, the heavy bass of the music fading behind me as I made my way back to the dorm. The night was cool, the air thick with humidity. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I was being watched. But the streets were empty. By the time I got to my room, exhaustion had set in. I tossed my shoes aside and flopped onto my bed. The moment my head hit the pillow, I was out. Then I heard it. Water. Dripping. I groggily opened my eyes. The sound was faint but steady, like droplets falling into a puddle. My mouth was dry, my limbs heavy. I turned my head toward the noise. The closet door was open, just a crack. And from inside, drip, drip, drip. I swallowed hard, sitting up slowly. The dorm room was dark, but my phone cast a faint glow from my nightstand. I reached for it, using the screen's dim light to scan the room. My heart pounded. The air was damp, and there was that smell, chlorine. I stared at the closet, trying to convince myself I had left it open earlier, that I had imagined the sound. But as I shifted to get up, the door creaked open a little wider. Drip, drip, drip. My throat tightened. I reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, a gust of cold, wet air rushed through the room. Then, a whisper, right next to my ear. "Come back to the pool." I screamed, scrambling backward, knocking over my lamp in the process. The room was plunged into deeper darkness. My breaths came in sharp gasps as I grabbed my phone, its dim light flickering across the floor. The puddle was gone, the closet was closed, the room was silent. For the next hour, I sat frozen on my bed, heart pounding. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I convinced myself it had been a dream. The alcohol, the late night, my overactive imagination. I pulled the covers up to my chin and closed my eyes. When I woke up, my sheets were damp, and my hair smelled like chlorine. I tried to ignore it, tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but the feeling didn't go away. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. The whisper echoed in my head. That night, I avoided my dorm for as long as possible, staying out at the library until they kicked me out. But eventually I had to go back. Lisa was out again, so I was alone when I crawled into bed. every nerve in my body on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up underwater. My body seized in panic. Cold, dark water surrounded me, pulling me down. I kicked, clawing toward the surface, but I couldn't see it. My lungs burned. I tried to scream, but only bubbles escaped. A hand wrapped around my ankle. I thrashed, twisting to look down, and there he was, the pale man from the pool. His face was inches from mine, his lips curling into a grotesque smile. I kicked harder, but his grip was like iron, dragging me deeper, deeper. My vision blurred. The pressure built in my chest. My limbs slowed. His dark, hollow eyes consumed me. Then suddenly, I gasped awake. I was in my bed, my sheets soaked through, my body shaking, my lungs desperate for air, my hands scrambled at my throat, convinced I was still drowning. But I wasn't. I was dry. My room was silent, except for the water. Dripping. I turned my head slowly toward the closet. The door was wide open, a pool of water stretched across the floor, and standing in the middle of it, him, his soaking wet body, his lifeless black eyes, and that smile. "Come back to the pool," he whispered. The lights flickered, the room filled with the sound of rushing water, and then darkness. Lisa found me the next morning, curled up in the corner of the room, trembling, my sheets still damp. She thought I was sick. I didn't tell her what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. But I haven't slept since. And every night, just as I start to drift off, I hear it. Drip, drip, drip.